Our webinar today is on mental wellness, titled Healing Generational Trauma at the Roots, Brainspotting, a Gateway to the Past. At this time, I would like to introduce our presenter, Steve Sawyer. Steve is a dual licensed psychotherapist filled with passion and knowledge surrounding the intervention and change process. His experience comes from 2 decades of intervention with tough to reach client populations in therapy settings ranging from residential, community-based, outpatient, and wilderness therapy. He is a trained trainer of several unique therapeutic models, including Brainspotting and HeartMath. Steve co-founded New Vision Wilderness Therapy programs with a trauma-informed and clinical focus with 3 locations spanning across the country. He continues to work as a core therapeutic training development staff with the Institute of HeartMath, receiving their Humanitarian Heart Award in 2018, and he is a leading active international Brainspotting trainer. Along with his training of phase 1 and 2, he developed the developmental trauma-focused model of Brainspotting. Steve's native-focused work is as a Wellbriety Mending Broken Hearts trainer and Generation Red Road facilitator. His trainings are recognized nationwide for cutting-edge therapeutic technique, science, and inspiration. And with that, I will go ahead and hand things over to you, Steve.
Thank you, Taylor. All those words. Wopula for all the relatives that are attending, grateful and humbled for the support of White Bison with such a powerful model. Wakanishnaji, Imachi Ape, Taya, Pusata. I greet you with an open heart and a handshake from our Lakota language. I'm a Hunka tribal member of the Pine Ridge tribe. My relatives out there made me full relations through ceremony. My grandmother is a split feather, a Native woman who didn't share her adoption story into the white Christian colonized indoctrination that she went through until she was 88 years old. She was Choctaw and Cherokee both. And when we look back throughout all of the pictures in history, her hair was chopped short, and she wasn't allowed to birth family for the majority of her time. We know a very limited amount at this point. It's one of those stories that we often encounter in Indian country where we don't know what really happened for people and know their full story. So I wanted to acknowledge her first and my relatives that support me day in and day out. We have some guests here today. I wasn't sure, but we have David Grand, the founder of Brainspotting, on here. So wave your hand there, David. Thank you for attending, and I'll give you a time in a little bit here for sure. So thank you for joining. Honored to have you on here supporting this community and cultural aspect of what we're doing. We have lots of Brainspotting International people on here. We've got people that are just inquisitive from the Wellbriety movement. And so hopefully what I have put together for you all will be good for everyone involved from all different ranges. Before I really get started, and I even open up my PowerPoint, I just want to give a forewarning. I did this similar presentation at the Native Dads Network National Conference with like over 100 people in attendance in my workshop last week. It just was. Mike Duncan might be on here somewhere. But with that said, this material, when we even start to talk about this, is triggering, and I really try to walk and practice not just a trauma-informed model, but a trauma-responsive model of interaction. And so I forewarn people that hopefully you have supports in your life and you identify who they are. Because there was one woman in particular in that workshop that was present to you all. I had to cut a lot of the information out from that hour-and-a-half presentation down to an hour. So some key elements I pulled out were some really scientific quantitative examinations of shame and some other things like that. Maybe down the road we can take another look at that if White Bison wants to have me back on. But inside of that, I just want to forewarn some of you, it could be triggering. It hits us at that blood memory level when we start to talk about these things. I remember one of my more profound experiences with blood memory. It's been through all my whole ceremonial life, which goes far back, way before my grandmother told us who we were. But with Regina, we were in a workshop, and and it was a cultural awareness workshop. It was a DEI initiative for Brainspotting International, and they played one video snippet, just like not even 5 minutes, a couple minutes of it. And in that, it had a lot of the traditional clothing of the Southeastern tribes visually represented. And like I've done a lot of work, you all, like on my own history, trauma, developmental trauma, and like it knocked me on my tail. I was spun out for a little while, and I know what to do with that today. But before I was really aware of this concept of blood memory was kind of a distant idea, or I had some sense of it, which I'll talk about more in a little bit, but it hadn't been fully hit with the precision and accuracy that those Southeastern clothing made for me. It was profound to me. So I just say that because I always want to be wise to how I move forward in a conversation here, and just bring that up, as a part of this process. And I'm going to switch to a share screen mode here, and acknowledge who needs to be acknowledged before I even go another step further. I just wanted to say that before I forgot, and bring that awareness in. This comes from this presentation. It's titled, Gateways to the Past for White Bison's Purposes, but this comes directly from Iktomi's web, which is in our Lakota language is the spider. And so we could talk about this all, but to move forward in it, I wanted to first acknowledge the elders that have blessed me in my life in two different arenas. And for those of you that are elders here that speak, I'm speaking in front of you, please forgive me. I've been asked to share this story here. And I do it as an Iktomi Shasha. I'm just a humble two-legged man. I've learned some stuff along the way, but these people have blessed my life. And so I want to acknowledge Chief Wakion Stamani, my Hunka father there on the left. That's us on Pine Ridge. My birth father on the lower left, who dove abalone for 40 years for our people and has plenty of shells that have been passed out throughout Indian country. Most of all, my grandmother, who finally at 88 had the courage to share her story. She didn't want to tell her story for fear of reprisal for 88 years of her life, you all. This is a tragedy that we have in Indian country around people not being able to share their story. Jean Thenok's teachings, yes, Don Koyas and Don Koyas welcoming me into this team of White Bison is a deep honor, and I don't know that he's on here today. However, me and Don actually met over 20 years ago, or I think we figured out it was like 18 years ago, 15 years ago, somewhere. We were at a conference. We were both speakers at a trauma conference, and we went out to eat, and we were talking about recovery at the table with another woman from the conference, and he shared. She said to him, "Hey, Don, I really appreciate your 4 seasons teachings on recovery. If any of you that are on here in recovery, it's very powerful. If you haven't interacted with it, but." She said, I was at 16 years when I got that teaching, and it changed my whole next year. It was so profound, and it changed my recovery moving forward. And here I was sitting at that table right on the edge of my 16 years. And sitting at that table, he gave that teaching to me, and it changed my recovery from thereafter. But at that time, I was culturally involved, but it didn't have the personal meaning to me yet. And then later on, to have such a profound connection now, as my grandmother told her truth, and how that has been accepted by the White Bison community and brought me into that fold. The White Bison trainers, Sparrow and Albert both mentoring me into the Mending Broken Hearts curriculum and offering that. And one of my elders who's been a crucial part of my life, Roy. So acknowledging all these people that put me where I sit today with the knowledge that I have, and have guided me and are the most important people in my life to date. Let's see here. Gotta get it. There we go. When it comes to trauma, I shared this at the conference. I don't know why me, but I am a blessed man when it comes to who I get to interact with in trauma world. When we start to talk about trauma, these faces are some of the most well-known and respected faces in the world. And have my whole life in school and stuff, I learned by mentorship, and each one of these individuals is still an active part of my life. I'm texting with Gabor Mate a couple of weeks ago and talking about big T, little T, and we're kind of having a texting session. He says, well, just read the chapter of my book that comes out in September, but you can't share it with anybody else. You can read it. Gabor has been a huge part of reshaping some of what I'd been even trained on trauma work in my career, of where the focus is. And we have, David Grant, who's on here, and I just want to give you a moment to just address the community. I wanted to acknowledge you here first as my mentor, who taught me this brain spotting world. I literally would knock on his doorstep over in Manhattan, and he brought me in as one of the trainers, and gosh, we've been on a road ever since, David, and just grateful for you and all you've done with that. And inside of that community, the connections that have come with Demir Demont, to be a German neuroscientist, you have to be really legit. And this guy, sat and talked. We talked all night one night at our national conference, the mentorship of that. And Stephen Porges, this was a key moment in this lower left one. Stephen Porges and David Grant on a stage together doing a neurological analysis on a session that was, being witnessed here. And then two key people that were the Trauma Center of Boston, Bessel van der Kolk and Joe Spinazzola. When we start to talk about developmental traumas research, when you search the studies that are out there on it, Joe Spinazzola's name is on like over 60% of them. He's a massive person behind the movement towards focusing on developmental trauma, which we're going to talk a lot about in here. But with this acknowledgement, David, would you be willing to come on and just address the community here? We have 54 tribal community members. You have some brain spotters on here too. Would you be willing to? I'm going to stop my share and just come on and say a couple words.
Thank you, Steve. Your work has always honored me and honored brain spotting. And for that, I have deep gratitude and appreciation. When I put out the neuro-experiential model of brain spotting in July at our international conference, I said that we call it the neuro part is not just Western science by any means. That encompasses all healing arts from the West, from the East, but especially the indigenous healing arts. I made sure that was fully included in the neuro-experiential model of brain spotting. But I'll just to honor everybody who's here now, I'll say that in essence, and Steve, you know this better than anybody, in essence, brain and it goes to where the healing is, and it doesn't look for categorization. Okay, it looks for presence and for opportunity, and so it's my honor to be here with you and with all of you, and it's my honor and my opportunity to learn together with all of you.
Well, thanks for joining, David. I know how busy you are and how much you travel, and I sent it to you and said you could make it, but I understand, I know how busy you are, so I just feel grateful that you're here to share with this community and see the community that supports this. And part of our cultural belief system is to really honor those elders that have taken care of us and taught us what we know, and you taught me the most out of everyone on here about this work. So thank you.
Thank you.
All right, I'm going to click this back on now. I have to keep moving the Zoom bars to be able to hit play and restart. So as we move forward, these people have informed a lot of what I put together. I'll hit a little bit of research too. To all these individuals that have shaped my understanding, I am forever grateful and don't deserve to have the level of mentorship that I had. I just am blown away every day to be able to have had this kind of guidance. So Iktomi is a spider in our language. She's known as the trickster, and he's the trickster in a lot of ways. And we have a lot of stories around this, and I'm gonna hold off on a lot of stories about him. However, some of your nervous systems are already crawling, right? This is how powerful Iktomi is. For a lot of people, they even see the image of a spider and their skin begins to crawl. And why is Iktomi the trickster? His ability to make it an invisible web and place it in just the right location to harvest from what he needs from the universe to catch something in its web, and is profound. And the beauty of the web. We're going to talk about the metaphor that I use for a spider's web with the nervous system ahead, but in particular, Iktomi is known to, be scary to a lot of our people, makes people anxious. Your nervous system crawls. I was told by an elder a long time ago that fear not the spider, because within him is the venom that can get rid of the most deepest injury and pain. And so the ability to, the poison, as much as it's feared by Iktomi when used, or thought in a way of the potential for healing, that rage, anger, deep, incredible woundedness, profound grief, all these things can fall before Iktomi's capabilities and powers. And the other part of this story is that invisible web that is out there in the woods, and we're walking through and we intersect with it. It has an incredible impact on our nervous system. And here's a little native humor for you. There's no better karate instructor than a spider web in your face. That said, though, that feeling that comes, with Iktomi of this feeling of aggravation, uneasiness, all starts to translate to the story that we're going to be working through today, and that I have a limited amount of time to share with you. But to show you the power of Iktomi in the nervous system, and this is where I start to merge, and I'm grateful that I am able to and have received thousands of traditional teachings, but also merge with modern science in the world, especially with my work with the Institute of Heart Math. This is an example of Iktomi in their nervous system. This was a young lady sitting at the trailhead in our wilderness therapy program in Wisconsin, and we were pre-testing her nervous system for stress and stress management capability. That's part of trauma responsive care, is being able to see what somebody's capability to manage stress is. While she was sitting there, a spider literally climbed up the back of my screen and jumped and parachuted on his web off and landed in the middle of the screen. And you can probably see on this line of heart rate variation, stress response, exactly where that spider jumped onto the screen. So you could see this spike in her heart rate to 150 beats per minute, actually goes slightly off the scale and ends up about here, about 150 beats per minute, while she's completely sitting still. So she didn't run away from my computer. I said, hang on, wait. I wanted to catch this. I wanted to catch this measurement. Now, the amazing thing about this young woman was that she had done a lot of therapeutic work until we worked with her even, still needed to regulate her nervous system and put it back into stability, was shown here, where her nervous system spikes, blows up, and then settles right back down. She's able to use a technique to self-regulate, we call it, and the ability to calm our nervous system, and the power of being able to do that resides in that she had a nervous system that had the flexibility to be spiked and then settle back down like that. And when we start to talk about healing trauma of the past, we start talking about historical trauma or generational trauma that's stored inside the nervous system. It's very difficult to work with. For a lot of us that are native, that are on here, go through years of work, and still there's something else there. We can't answer what it is. We're not sure what it is. And some of you might be getting my slight humor that comes on my native side when we talked about something else. I should have just put one of those right in here. Those of you that know what I'm talking about, CNN was doing a population assessment in a show and called our native people something else. But you have to understand native humor to know that then everybody got something else shirts and posted something else everywhere. But there's something there. There's something else. There's something else that exists inside of us. And some of us will start to label that blood memory. Some of us will start to label that as epigenetics, but we're going to kind of pull that apart a little bit. But for a lot of Native people, there's something else there. It's just this sense that something else is there. You can't quite touch it, and it's invisible. And that's where Iktomi's web, it's there. You catch a glimpse of it in the light as you're walking through the forest, but you can't quite see it. it's invisible and it's tricky. So you start walking that way and you think you see it, it's over there, but then it's over here and it's spreading across that whole area based upon how the light hits it. When the light hits it on the right spot, it becomes visible. Otherwise, it stays invisible until something comes along and shines the light on it for us in our nervous system. Don Coyes really pushed us all to look deeper at the root of our native communities and the issues that are happening within them. And this is part of the power of the Wellbriety movement. For those of you that are not familiar with the work of Wellbriety, really pushing to look at deeper emotional aspects that are behind or the roots of the trees that are destroying our native communities. And that includes the drug use, the violence, all these things, right? And so inside of that, there's still, right, inside of this, at the very deep level, it's tough to be able to get a finger on for a lot of our native people. It's there, it gets triggered from time to time, potentially, or it's just kind of down there lurking in people's sense. When we're talking about something else is there, a lot of times it's down in those roots somewhere beyond our awareness and our ability to recall. A lot of our trauma treatment modalities have been built upon acute trauma experience where we utilize modalities that are meant for a specific memory. But when we start to talk about these root issues, it stays very embedded and difficult to access. So a lot of people have a hard time accessing a specific memory to heal with that. Inside of the Native community, because it's kind of oftentimes so rampant in our communities, the unhealthiness that's there, et cetera, we keep pretending that we're not hurt, right? That's part of how we survive as people of trauma, is to walk through it, to push through it, to ignore it, to be tougher than it, et cetera, which is all part of our of trying to get access to our resiliency. But to what you learn inside of the nervous system, to get access to full resiliency, you actually have to go down into the pain and suffering before the fullest resiliency can show itself. And so inside of that, we have to be able to not just talk about historical trauma, not just talk about generational trauma, but go into the profound hurt that's there. That's part of our Brainspotting philosophy, is to go towards pain and suffering and hurt, not walk around it, not take shortcuts, not try to soften it, but to go straight at it. And that's part of our mentality when we start to look at this work. So one of the ongoing debates, discussions, et cetera, inside of Native country is epigenetics. We know that epigenetics is powerful. We know that it has impact. But when I started looking into epigenetics, I was pretty fascinated. This is by the way, if you need to take a screen picture, go ahead so you can get this link to go back to. But when you look at this particular article, starts to pull apart a lot of the studies on epigenetics. And it's a pretty simple, easy read for anybody who wants to take a look at it. But there was some fascinating findings. And for those of you that talk a lot about epigenetics, I'm sure you might have different studies that say different things, et cetera. But what I found was profound is that this one is cited almost the most, that I'm going to talk about next. And when it was cited the most, it was cited towards epigenetics. But when you read the actual study, it's interesting when you start to look at the percentages that it starts to assign to our struggle when we look at human nervous systems. And so is it, to be crystal clear, I actually usually have a slide behind this. When I say next, doesn't mean I'm dismissing epigenetics as an influencer. I'm putting a puzzle together that challenges a little bit of sometimes our that part of us that just kind of like, well, it's in my nervous system, and so I can't really heal it, or it's epigenetics, it's just within me. And some of us that utilize that to kind of stay in a space of not moving forward and healing. So when we look at epigenetics, this was one of the most highly cited studies, found this. These studies have demonstrated that common DNA sequence variation and rare mutations account for only a small fraction, 1 to 2% of total risk for inheritance and personality traits and mental disorders. 1 to 2%. I see some eyebrows raising out there, rightfully so, okay? Rightfully so. This does not mean that they do not influence, but it is assigning how much influence. So this is sometimes shocking for people to hear this, right? There's a lot of talk and mention of epigenetics in Indian country, but how are we looking at the research very carefully and sifting through it? Doesn't mean it doesn't have impact, and we're going to pull this apart. But part of this is building to a story of some other routes to be examining also. So some other sightings inside of that other article beside this, by the way, this study is one of the most cited studies on epigenetics out there, this particular one. These environmental factors, including early childhood, can cause changes in expression of genes conferring risk of mental health and chronic conditions. Thus, the examination of genetic, epigenetic, and environmental interactions from a developmental perspective may determine the nature of gene misregulation and psychological disorders. The next statement, and just to get through this quickly because of our time, is that it's really hard to pull it apart, because when you look at Native people and what many of us are growing up in and what's happening in our communities, the ability to rule out the environmental factor from the epigenetics becomes almost virtually impossible. So it's something to be thinking about there. There are some research elements out there that put some of this together, but this is just one story to be considering, is that sometimes we can use epigenetics as a place of powerlessness, like, well, it's inside of me. What can we even do about epigenetics? And this is where these next slides come from. I will just say this, that the degree of positive attachment was found to be incredibly impactful, right? Incredibly impactful on biological defensive systems, reproductive success, and adequate parenting in the next generation was Bradshaw's work. So that's old work there. But we know that attachment and caregiver responsiveness is a key factor in a lot of this. But when we look at the epigenetics, we have to start to examine a chain of this struggle, right? If we take a chain and we take one link out of that chain, what happens to the chain? It falls apart. So many of us talk about historical trauma, generational trauma, and even distinguish between those two. Colonialism trauma. I had a woman who came up to me who her family line was right there at Plymouth Rock, where the initial colonizers landed. And she was in my workshop and had a profound experience with what she experienced inside of that. The historical trauma, to keep it going into future generations, has to be impacted by developmental trauma. Because for future generations to carry on historical trauma, you have to enact the gene sequence. So to show you that, most of these things are recessive. They're far down until they're absolutely necessary. So they're really not for immediate use. They're not automatic. They don't come on to just kind of take over our lives and make us now trauma sensitive or reactive. There has to be environmental catalysts first. So I have this recessive, I have the epigenetics inside of me. I have to have the environmental catalyst that gets that gene online and kind of gets it speaking. Then I have an environmental effectiveness experience with that. So that gene starts to speak and it helps me in that situation. And it's effective. Now it can transition from being a recessive gene to a dominant gene. Now, what's the key in this chain? We have to have environmental catalyst and we have to have environmental effectiveness for this epigenetics to come alive. So inside of that, where can we start to take action? I'm all about action, and people that follow me on like my trauma transformations page and that kind of stuff, like I'm all about taking action in active healing process. And it's not the epigenetics does not matter at all, you all, to hear me really clearly on this. It's that what can we take action on in regards to all of this? And it's the environmental catalyst and environmental effectiveness variables. So to awaken blood memory, we have to have this sequence to occur. So when we look at that, when we start to talk about treating this or healing this, this is a really important quote that I think about all the time. We are not about changing what happened, because we know what happened at Plymouth Rock. We know what happened across our country. I have some more maps that I got from a guy that I built into the longer version of this that I do. It's about we're changing the way it lives within us in the current time. So to change how it lives within us, we have to look in a couple of other places that haven't been talked about as much. When we look at the trauma treatment field, the majority of the trauma treatment field was built upon PTSD, which the research behind PTSD, most of it correlated initially coming out of wartime, right? So we have a combat fatigued is the word they used back then. An individual comes out and they would do something to work on that fear response that individual had in relation to their experience in combat. There would be a specific experience that would be online for them in their nervous system, and then there'd be some trigger that would come along, and that would come alive. I'm going to show you what that looks like in HRV in a moment. Then you have complex trauma, which means now I've had a stack of experiences that start to embed. So the fluctuating reaction, there's less trigger specificness, there's more generalization in the nervous system to this complex trauma. I've had this up and down experience with the world around me, and usually involving some forms of caregivers, where in my brain's developmental time frame, it becomes embedded. The reactiveness becomes embedded into the nervous system itself. A continuous state of stress response. Or David really coined this term that I'm aware of, David, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but the idea of what a 24-hour flashback is, meaning that the body has been bathed inside of stress response and reactivity, and then it's now embedded into the nervous system and moves forward that way. And so when we start to look at experiences, a lot of adult experiences will develop complex trauma, but developmental trauma is in those formulative years of the brain developing how it works in the world around it. To show you some of the research on that, I first acknowledge another person who taught me a lot on is Joe Spinazzola. This comes, the following slides come from a presentation that we put together years ago for the campaign to heal childhood trauma. We gave it all along the East Coast, went in this big bus, and we went through all these communities and presented this. He really helped me in taking the immense amount of research out there and getting down to these really, really crucial points that we're going to hit real quickly. One of the most important studies on developmental trauma is the Unseen Wound Study. And it's from the National Childhood Traumatic Stress Network, psychological maltreatment study. It looked at 5,616 youth that experienced these things. Now, for those of you that are working in Native country, you know how frequent, right? Sexual abuse is, for example, in our communities, physical abuse. And then like psychological abuse is like almost set to the side because there's so much of these other two going on. The psychological abuse and verbal abuse is just as rampant. This encompasses a lot of our people, a lot of our upbringings, a lot of what we come up in. So inside of that, they took that study and they narrowed it down to 1,699 individuals. And they looked at the specific symptoms. When they assessed the symptoms very carefully, this is what you have for the symptoms from greatest to least. And if we just look at the first 5, okay, affect dysregulation, emotional dysregulation. We don't have any problems with emotions in Native country, right? We're just totally healthy when it comes to emotional expression. Attention and concentration. The ADHD diagnosis is rampant, and many of our kids get put on stimulant medications for that. Negative self-image. This is where culture becomes such a powerful healing structure because we start to counter or work directly on that negative self-image and embracing who we are. Impulse control and aggression, right? When we go across this span of all these symptoms, the actual specific criteria of PTSD doesn't even fall in the first 10. Let me take a drink here, y'all. So when we follow a PTSD treatment modality for a lot of Native country, we're missing the mark. So that gateway from historical trauma to developmental trauma, and getting that gateway in between requires treatment with this awareness of what the research has shown us. PTSD's criteria meet some of our people's process, but developmental trauma fits it very accurately. And so inside of this, treatment modalities that have been built on PTSD are very traumatic event oriented. You take a specific event, you do specific work on that one event. But what happens when you have a lifetime of exposure in your developmental process? There's one word that rings through that diagnosis very clearly: dysregulation. And it's 6 different forms of dysregulation that are listed here. So emotional dysregulation or affect dysregulation, somatic dysregulation, instability in our bodies. Look at hypertension. Or I was just talking to my bro from Pine Ridge this morning on FaceTime. I could tell that his medication is off on his high blood pressure. It's part of that body's lack of stability. We know that from our research at HeartMath too, that's directly correlated with stress response. Attentional dysregulation, behavioral dysregulation. How many of our Native kids get labeled with bad behavior, oppositional defiant disorder? So self-dysregulation and relational dysregulation, all 6 of these are parts of the criteria of what the outcome is for people that grow up in developmental trauma. What are we doing? Are we treating how it lives within us, or are we talking about what happened? We have to have an awareness of both. But the living within us, this is the living within us. It's in these 6 categories. Having precision treatment focused on that and healing on that is a key element to getting through and healing this historical trauma process. To show you what a PTSD flashback looks like and measurement, this individual, he's actually doing some self-regulation. He's got some improvement going over here. And then he has a flashback. This kid did have some conflict with his dad, but it wasn't regular. And there was one event where they both got really heated. They got kind of in an argument. His dad was holding him against the wall, and then his hand slipped and ended up on his neck, and he was still trying to hold him back. And the boy's perception of this was, I was being choked. When he's doing his self-regulation technique of breathing stuff that many therapists teach, his nervous system spikes and has a memory. This is what a memory capsule looks like, embodied inside of the body, and it's held inside and then opened up at a particular time. Big PTSD flashback. He spikes out at 190 beats per minute, by the way, sitting completely still. This is his nervous system trying to calm him back down. So this makes sense to treat the element of the event with his conflict with his dad. And then we're going to see this go down a big notch. When we look at developmental trauma, it looks different than that. This is what developmental trauma looks like. It's all over the place. It's all over the place. So the nervous system is bouncing off the walls and up and down and all over, and it's changing so rapidly and dysregulated, changing rapidly, constantly, that the stress device can barely read it. These red markings it's having a hard time reading the changes in the nervous system that are happening so constantly by every stimulus that's outside of them. And this is part, and I usually have more built into this, where I teach about how like a developmental traumatized nervous system gets hypervigilant to the world and what's going on around it. So inside of that, this is what is the link between historical trauma, getting those genes online, getting those genes activated, and those genes are now activated online and now staying reactive. So now it becomes a stress response pattern, where now it becomes ingrained into the nervous system. This dominant gene structure starts to run the nervous system along with the trauma and the capsules that are associated that brought it on. So inside of that, this is a totally different kind of healing structure than most of us are used to. I got to move along, you all. So after a traumatic event, the nervous system gets struck on self-preservation mode. We have to focus on these 6 forms to actually heal the nervous system. So this is how we work with brain spotting. Brain spotting allows us to work on things that are a sensation in the body or something's in there And we don't have to have a specific memory that's associated with that. When we utilize it, a lot of times it will come back, it will reveal itself. Different memories and capsules that are associated with any one of these survival structures will show themselves. So inside of that, a memory, a capsule can show itself. It's because we're not stuck on having a single event that we're working on. So the spiderweb metaphor is that when we start on any particular issue, when we go back to Iktomi's web, if we're working on anger, for example, when we brain spot, and we're going to talk about how we do that in 1 minute, there's all these other situations that are inside of that web. I'm angry about something in my life. I'm angry at my boss. I'm angry at my wife. I'm angry at my kids. I don't even know what I'm angry at sometimes. And so for it to show itself, what these question marks are, we have to practice a lot of patience and a lot of quiet. That's part of our brain spotting strategy, is to be very quiet and let the nervous system reveal itself. So, oh, I'm angry and I'm angry at my life. Now I'm feeling some of the hurt. And then inside of that hurt, it kind of cascades down to feeling alone. And then I'm sitting alone for a little while, and I'm sitting there with that therapist, and they're holding that space for me. And then these pre-verbal, these pre-memory elements can show themselves. So inside of that, we have to have some basic safety to get access to that. Here's another little native humor for you, right? For a lot of us that are working in Indian country, like, it's hard to get started with this work because people are like trapped in a really tough place, right? There's a lot of things going on in their lives. So we have to always acknowledge that, right? We can't just go in and start pounding on developmental trauma work or historical trauma work and not acknowledge the current moment, because that's going to affect a lot of how our structure is around us. Inside of brain spotting, we don't believe in avoiding triggers. If anything inside of that web is left, it just keeps moving around, right? So inside of that Iktomi's web, when a fly lands on and it's stuck, it just keeps moving around and shaking the whole web. We can't avoid it. We go straight. What does the spider do? He goes straight to what's moving his web. And that's how we start to utilize some of that medicine in brain spotting, is we go right at triggers. And healing happens when you're triggered and you're able to move through the pain, the pattern, and the story, walking to a way different ending. And as Gabor Mate said when I did brain spotting on his historical trauma from the Holocaust, was that it was like I jumped inside of his capsule of aloneness and blew it apart with him. That was how he translated his session with him, right? That's how brain spotting works. When we look at healing ancestral trauma, most require a target. We don't have to have a specific memory. We can feel sensations of our ancestors, or maybe that spirit world that our people are far more open to than the Western philosophy world. And inside of that, spiritual wounds, etc., we sense them. And in brain spotting, we can actually just work right there. We don't have to go get complex about doing all kinds of things to set up to be ready to work on it. If you have a felt sense about anything, we can start there. So one of the things I do tell people is that some of the most important work is working on the capsules of powerlessness and aloneness. That those experiences, and I have a whole story I tell about Gabor Mate in the woods visiting our program, but I don't have time for it now. But it's often isn't the initiating trauma that creates the seemingly insurmountable pain, but the lack of support after. So in brain spotting, we try to get everything out of the way that is just going to allow them to feel we're there with them. That includes us even talking. We do a setup, we call it, to get these things online in the nervous system, the felt sense of this pain, and allow it to come on. I'd love to tell this story, but I don't have the time, so I can get to it. Now, what I do put in here, I have a LinkedIn. If you're going to enact power therapies like these kinds of things that are incredibly powerful, make sure you read this article I wrote on my LinkedIn account. It's just Steve Sawyer, LCSW, because there's a whole lot that goes with this, including training, consultation, supportive structures, building supportive structures around the individual who might be living in that snake stomach still. we can do some work and develop that around them. We do a lot of that in our acute care scenario, but for those of you that might be working in your communities, it's really important. Now, usually I'll do a little bit of an experience with this and we'll see if we kind of get some time. I want some stories to get shared, but to give you the logistics of brain spotting, here's one of our old wilderness therapists sitting in the woods. He's with a young man who's working on an issue, and we're utilizing the eyes. And the eyes are really, really important. And there's a whole science behind this that I can't really tear down for you today. However, our human brain, especially the autonomic functions in the back, our stress, our visual field. So if we feel something is threatening, we automatically look at it to produce predictability about how we're going to respond. And in brain spotting, we don't move the eyes around like some of the other modalities that are out there. We keep it very still, because if I know the lion's right there, he's standing over there in the corner of the woods, I know if he's looking a little more to the left that I should probably run to the right. And what the eye position does in brain spotting is allows our nervous system to take action on what it didn't take action of before. Experientially go through the process of facing that tiger at that moment, and our nervous system being able to respond and let that capsule of information out. So it's not trapped internally anymore. So in the neuroexperiential model, it's the idea that we're going to take the nervous system through an experience that it didn't get to work through before. And that can be your ancestors. And I did see a lady who came on that's going to be able to join it, just give a couple minutes of her story on this to wrap this up. So we get there's a whole setup that we do to get the nervous system online in its stress response mode. We get an eye position that gives the nervous system some predictability of where the threat is at. And then we let the nervous system go through the experience, but not alone, with us as a clinician right there holding the space for them. And that's where Gabber translated it into, is like, you jumped into my capsule, basically translating how he said it, like into his Holocaust capsule with him, and was there with him. So he wasn't alone. And then his nervous system was able to get all that out of his system. So when a client or a relative's storm wells up, how brain spotting works is it meets our calm. So my nervous system dysregulates if I'm the client or the relative who's being worked on. And then if I am the person doing the brain spotting, I'm very calm. They meet in the middle. And my nervous system starts to message their nervous system in an experience where their highest fear is online, that it's going to be okay. We can say that verbally all we want. We're going to say this at a nervous system level in brain spotting. So there's a lot that's behind all of this that we in what we do. I think one thing I want to highlight in this for our Native people is we really believe in a non-oppressive expert model of intervention. That means our spiritual elders can learn this. That means our medicine people can learn this. Our peer support individuals in recovery. We're not into this hierarchy model of I'm a therapist, I'm a psychologist, and then I can help you. So that's part of the work that we're doing with that. Other thing in Indian country that you all know, quietness and non-talking is embraced. We can work on an entire trauma, not saying a word. It's very powerful for that. To sit there with them with that and not having to talk about the trauma, but then being able to work through it and release it anyways. Matilda was going to join us today. She got in a scheduling jam, but this just to read quickly about her experience. She's an elder inside of her Wellbriety community. She wrote this. She's given me permission. She sent me the pictures of her earlier life and some of her ceremonial stuff here to share with the relatives here. Good morning, Matthew. BSP is flexing off the chains of boarding school, residential school, post-traumatic stress disorder. So she was an actual boarding school survivor. I've been brainwashed to believe I'm inferior because of my color of my skin. Feeling inferior, I isolated myself, stayed home a lot. I drank, gambled, ate, didn't mingle. I kept busy. I also felt so inferior to non-native people. Brain spotting is helping me remove those chains. In brain spotting phase 1, which she took in December, I took the risk of volunteering to share her story or fear in front of my peers. I wrote this the other day, but neglected to send that part of it. The last thing I want to wrap up with you all, and so we can get to at least some questions, and I'll stay on a little extra if people have more questions. I'm sure there's a bunch in there right now. But I want to invite Brooke. I saw you come on, or did you get on all the way? I saw you kind of go on and off. Did you make it on?
Yeah, I made it on.
So you all, I just want to welcome Brooke Jordan. She is a beautiful native lady from up there in the Northwest to join us. And she's built into this, but instead of me telling her story, you know, you just have a couple minutes, Brooke, to just kind of share. But I did put in here the slide of you with your family, and really want to invite you to just take a moment and share with the relatives that are on here. We have almost 60 relatives on here. You know, what your experience was with kind of getting access to that ancestral trauma that we saw you and Regina get access to in your session.
Okay. First off, Ladol, for thanking me or for having me. And also to everyone that's on here. I took Brainspotting phase 1 in April of last year, I believe. Very hesitantly, I volunteered when they were needing a demonstration. And for me, it was around, one of your slides that I saw, Steve, was around like a feelings that weren't ours, that we don't own. And that was very much what I came forward with. I had a lot of the time something that I just dubbed my ancestors cry. It was a grief that came from something that was so deeper than me that I carried. And waves of grief and guilt would come through. And I remember the way it came forward is I would have these experiences, and my dad had mentioned to me, he's like, well, maybe you were fighting against, or your people were fighting against people coming in, colonizers or missionaries or something like that. And my mom, who does a lot of energy healing work, stood up and she's like, it wasn't that we were fighting against them, it was that you had accepted them in. Immediately, waves of grief and guilt washed over me. And I literally felt like I was crumbling under it, where I could, oftentimes I would see a hand of a man, and they would be helping missionaries down or up into a wagon. And this was prior to that, but then everything, all the pieces started coming together. But during my Brainspotting session, everything, I was sitting there, and I remember my children were in the back because it was Zoom, and I heard them laughing. That was brought into the Brainspotting, and the laughing quickly turned to just screams of terror. And then just chaos unfolded inside me, where at one point my abs tightened where it felt like I was needing to turn to run. At one point I felt like I was being shot backwards through immense pressure in my chest, which I just knew had been a gunshot wound. And just things it felt so chaotic in the moment, or the 45 minutes. I know I was aware of one tear falling, but afterward I was told by the group that I maybe blinked in that whole 45 minutes, maybe 5 times. So like also you were saying, it was a very personal, quiet process, but everything that was done, I can talk about the experience now and not have those overwhelming feelings. And I know without a doubt that healed my ancestors as well as myself, and also freed up my children and future generations. So that's
Thank
kind of, if
you.
you have more questions, yeah.
Thank you, Brooke. Thanks for just sharing. That was such a powerful memory recall session that I just really am grateful and honored that you would share that with all the relatives that are here. And thank you for doing that and having the courage to do that. And I just thank you for that. You know, that's the power of witnessing that power that inside of our trainings alone is just so hard to translate to people until they see it or hear it.
Absolutely. Thank you.
All right, with that, we're at time, you all, but I will stay on and answer some questions. I'm willing to do so. So Taylor, feel free to moderate, or you know what not. But it looks like the crowd has been doing a good job of managing most of them in the chat bar. So grateful for that.
Yeah, if you have a question, go ahead and you can either type it into the chat box, or if you want to go ahead and raise your hand. If you don't know how to do that, just click on reactions and then raise hand, and we'll kind of get everyone in order.
One thing while people are doing that, and if we just see some hands raised, it's fine. So this is one of our brain spotting pointers. You get that in your training. to give you just kind of a more of a, you know, a sense about how it works. And I usually, like in my workshop, I actually had people do this, and it's hard to do it. And I don't like to do it on Zoom and then leave people potentially triggered or activated. But inside of it, we really work on getting the felt sense of anything. And it can be just something like, you know, Brooke was talking about. She had this ancestor's cry. And instead of having to have a memory to work on it, the felt sense of that memory in her body is how we access that. We have a setup that goes with that. And then we find an eye position that gives us the strongest sense of that feeling in the body, which enacts the body to open up that capsule and start to tell its story in a lot of cases. So if she felt it in her stomach, we might find the eye position correlated. And we have lots of different ways we find eye positions in brain spotting, where we get her eyes on a very specific location that gives her the strongest felt sense of that in her stomach. And then that allows the memory to show itself. All of our memory is in there. We just have to invite or allow the nervous system the right equation to tell its story. And that's what Brooke was talking about there. So she had a felt sense and then an eye position that allows the nervous system to now enact that. So that's how brain spotting works. It can be done on Zoom just like this. If you were my client right now, I can actually work with you to get set up and find an eye position. And again, without going into the training on it, you know, that's a little bit of how it works. And we have some ways that we don't even have to, we can utilize natural eye positions and use the eyes in a lot of specific ways. A lot of the brains, over half of the brain's material, the actual gray matter material, is devoted to vision. So for us to not use vision in our therapy keeps us limited in what we can do. And it messages directly to those autonomic nervous system structures of parts of the brain that are our automatic stress responses directly when we get the eyes involved. Okay. Where can they find the recording? Taylor, it sounds like some people are wanting. Thanks, David, for joining us.
Yep. So this will be recorded. It usually takes about a week or two to get posted, but you can go to www.wellbriety.com, and there's a section called Wellbriety Teachings. It will also be on YouTube. You can just search Don Koyas and it'll be posted there as well. And it looks like we do have a question. Sarah, if you want to go ahead.
Hi, thank you all for being here. I was wondering if you could provide an example of a setup for intergenerational trauma, and it's like this. If so, say I have an African American client, and there's definitely inroads, right? So there's racist comments coming from her employer, excuse me, or one of the clients in the practice that she works in. So that's an inroad, right? But if that doesn't exist, or it's hard to access those, is there some other setup that you could use, or some other inroad?
Yes. I will tell you that in my experience that oftentimes we have to kind of work backwards in time, which oftentimes when I get access to the ancestral memories is going to be when I'm doing very specific developmental trauma work. So, and there's a lot to that, and there's a lot to getting that really set up well. That's why I developed the developmental trauma model of brain spotting, because to get gateway to that next earlier material, it requires kind of working closer and closer to that memory part of the brain that's way back in time. So there are setups for that material. It sounds like you're a brain spotter already. But I will tell you, without going into a lot of detail on here with people that aren't brain spotting oriented or whatnot, that the developmental trauma doorway is often, I mean, sometimes like in Brooke's story, she got access just by doing some earlier work right in a regular session. And then for people that don't have some of that, it's by really working on those dysregulation areas. Dysregulation is the nervous system speaking from the past. So we follow that in, and that can take us to those next doorways. And there's a whole way that I teach that inside of the developmental trauma model, brain spotting. Going for the roots is what its name is.
Thank you.
Yep. But that will give you at least some places to start to look or work.
Steve, there's a question in the chat box. When will you be doing the Brainspotting and developmental trauma training?
Man, I get asked constantly. I am looking towards later summer. We're going into our ceremonial season, like actually this next month already. And so I'm looking towards August, September, October, somewhere in there. So just follow Trauma Transformations on Instagram. I post anything I'm doing there. We also have the phase 1 brain spotting training, the native focused brain spotting training inside of this next month. Oh, I had the flyer and I forgot to share it with everybody. Here, let me share screen again and get that up there.
Steve, I put my website where that has a link to that flyer because I wasn't able to attach the flyer to the chat.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
but that's there. It goes directly to the link for that flyer.
Okay, yeah, so she's got the link in there, and then if you need just a image of it quick, let me get it back up here. I'm gonna get that flyer up. It was after Brooke's story. Man, Brooke, thank you so much for coming on and joining. I know that you were running, and I appreciate that you were able to jump in. So I'm just so powerful to hear it directly. Me telling your story like at that level is just does not come close to giving it the power, the justice of what it's done in your life and others. So trying to get back to share screen and it's not giving me that there. Come on. I'm almost there, you all. But I'll share this flyer so you can snap a picture of it quick too. And let's see here, there we go. Now I got it. There is the flyer there, you all. You can snap a picture. So it's got some link information down in there. Look at Regina's website. Also, I'll be reposting this flyer on Trauma Transformations Instagram with the direct links to.
Okay, we've got another hand raised, Tracy.
Hey there, Tracy.
Hey there, Tracy. Hey, Steve. Hey, everybody. I'm glad I was able to jump on. I had to fight technology as I am a native. I'm not a native, I'm an immigrant to technology. But nonetheless, I just appreciated listening to your presentation. And I really appreciated your choice of languaging and speaking to your relatives in community, which languaging is so important, especially with brain spotting, in terms of the way you used it and just being a relative in community of marginalized folks. And so with that, I really want to say I appreciate you being out here doing this work. It's so important for us to take it home, if that makes any sense, right? And so just kudos to you, my Indiana Jones, and I'm just loving it of your presentation and sharing. Yeah. So I'm glad I was able to make your presentation and that ancestral work. I'm really interested in that because I'm just finding, even in listening to you all, knowing that your population has a lot to do with your culture and your roots in the Native American community. And so in listening to you, I was just like, wow. Every time I sit with marginalized people, it's like the faces are different, but oftentimes that root of that pain is very similar and same. So yeah, I'll be getting with you more on that in the research I'm doing with ancestral traumas and things of that nature. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Tracy. Thanks, appreciate it. Yeah, I think it's really essential. You know, so many of the therapeutic models that have been built out there are built upon oppressive, colonized ways of thinking. You know, even the factors of diagnosis, et cetera, it comes from a Western and colonized kind of thinking. And so inside of that, you know, to be able to break free of that for all of our people is essential. You know, to be able to get that deeper access to healing, we have to be able to, you know, not be practicing the models of our oppressors.
Well said. Ashe. Amen. Well said. Because even in these studies, they're not Native Americans that are being studied. They're not Black Americans that are being studied, right? And so dominant culture studied their own, and then they become even more oppressive by trying to force, right, their 1, 2, 3s on us, which we may be 8, 9, 10s. And so it's not always a fit, and it doesn't always hit that crawl or those capsules that we live with generationally, ancestrally. So
Yep.
no, I love it,
Yep.
Steve.
Yeah, so that's part of the focus on the developmental trauma aspect of, and the access to the nervous system dysregulation allows us to get into an access point that can get us further back in history, and that gateway, that chain that I was talking about, to work our way into that direction. I want to acknowledge Albert. Thanks for joining us. I come on late, buddy. Thanks for joining. I had you in my opening slide acknowledging my elders. So thanks for coming on. Glad you made it.
Absolutely. We're on different time zones. So when you sent me the invitation this morning, I registered and didn't pay attention to the time zone. So, we are really blessed to have you, Brother Steve. And thank you for all of your hard work. You too, Regina, David. Absolutely. I know David logged out, but really, really important work. And thank you for inviting me this morning.
You bet. All right, if there aren't any more questions, last minute questions, we'll leave it to that, then we'll exit off. But thank you all for joining, and hope to see some of the people that aren't trained on our native focused Brainspotting phase 1, and spread the word. In Native country, we learned how to get our way around, our colonizers, by spreading word of mouth. So that's the best way to get this information out there, that this is some very unique work that we're doing. And again, if it had been my ability throughout time to be able to demonstrate it on here, there are some small demonstrations. When I have an hour and a half, I built that in a little bit for people to be able to experience the power of what it does in your nervous system, even if we're just sitting here and did it. But please spread the word and have people, paying attention to the trainings coming up. And again, we don't believe in the hierarchical model. It doesn't have to be a clinician trained. Again, we have people that are trained that are from our communities all over the place, that are spiritual leaders, medicine people, and even peer support and recovery. So, it's a hard training, just to warn people, like emotionally, it's very emotionally taxing and challenging. But the other part is that we break out of all the rules, and we invite culture into that training, whether that's prayer, smudging, song, all kinds of things that happen inside that training in whatever organic way that it needs to show itself. And we've had a lot of powerful experiences with that. And so any of you would be welcome for that training. Okay. Any last minute questions on there, Taylor?
Anybody else have a question before we close those?
Thank you to all the relatives I see on here that were supporting, just even supporting me, and appreciate that. So Wopula to all you, and blessed to have so many of you blessing my life day in and day out. I'm grateful, and thank you again to the elders that have guided me in this journey and along this way. And hopefully our native communities can continue heading in that healing direction like they are. That resilience. We're not, we're the strongest representation of survivors, and inside of that resilience that's right there with us, fastest elements of healing. And so that's one thing I didn't mention, but in I did have it actually in one of the slides, but I was going fast, which is the resiliency factor that we tap into in Brainspotting is completely different from an idea, but it's from a nervous system perspective of resilience. And we could say the word resilience, but there's something that lives inside of us as much as that pain and that historical trauma is living inside of us. Our resilience is right there next to it. And when I get to do the live demonstration in a presentation, I can really show the power of both of those with each other, which is really profound. So, just know that no matter what, for any of you that were triggered in the process of this presentation, to go inside of your body and recognize and feel for that resilience that's inside there. It lives inside of every one of us that have the history of trauma. We also have that history that's right next to it of resilience. So make sure to tap into that and let that settle down your nervous system if some of what I talked about hit close to home. that, you know, it was profound when I, you know, when I did this at this conference 2 weeks ago, that, you know, there was people that accessed amazing stuff that blew me away, you know, in the span of that. So I usually like to end with a song, but since it's on Zoom, we're going to keep it like this. So thanks for joining, you all. Burn your medicines, take care of yourselves, have an incredible, beautiful day. And I'll wave at you over there, Trillium.